Welcome to the Generative Age,
a podcast that explores the rapidly evolving world of generative AI and its impact on education.
Guided by EdTech Director, author, and NICE board member Alana Winnick. We are joined by experts and practitioners in the field who are shaping the discourse of artificial intelligence in the classroom.
Whether you're an educator, administrator, technology leader, or simply interested in the future of education, join us on this journey through the Generative Age, powered by NICE. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you're probably expecting AI updates in the field. I'm going to shake things up, and moving forward, I'm going to have 2 episodes per month. One will be our guest spotlight speaker. This month, we're featuring Ken Shelton about AI bias and discrimination. And in the second episode, I'm going to feature all the AI updates from the field, as well as other resources, but you're going to have to tune in to find out what they are. And if you're not already signed up for my email list, make sure you go to alanawinnick.com and sign up, because I'm starting weekly emails that will be short and sweet and give you all the resources as they come out. And now let's get to it. Welcome to another episode of The Generative Age. Today we welcome a longtime friend of NICE, Ken Shelton. I've been waiting for a very, very long time for this episode, and I think we're finally really ready to dive into a very difficult topic that a lot of people aren't speaking about that's really incredibly important, especially in the world right now with AI. So I'll just give you a little brief introduction to Ken in case you're not familiar with him. He is a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. He's an instructional designer. He's a leadership coach, mentor, and development. He's a multi-award-winning educator. He's a former classroom teacher. Ken, what did you teach? I think it was history.
Actually, 3 subjects: English, social studies, and then I have a career in technical education certification, so I taught in a technology lab.
What level students did you teach?
Mostly middle school. Most of my career was middle school. High school was only a couple of years.
And then, fun fact, he has a background in, it's like design or something, right?
Yes. So my master's degree is in design, yes.
Yeah, that's what I remembered us talking about that.
Yeah.
So he's really good at design, and he's also a really incredible speaker. If you've never seen him speak, it's such a treat. He brings a passion. He makes you leave wanting to rethink a lot of what your practice is. And I think that's a really important skill for educators, is to always rethink what they're doing. So Ken's really great at that. He's a consultant, and he's a soon-to-be author. So Ken, do you know when your book's coming out?
Yeah, so if I stick to my current schedule, which you've published, so you know that that's a big if, but I will publish 3 books this year, with the first one coming out most likely no later than the end of next month, which is a book that I'm co-authoring with one of my best friends, Dee Lanier, literally on artificial intelligence.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's going to be your first book. I mean, it's a long time coming.
Yeah. There's that one. Then I'm working on one on Tequity. And then the third one is on, which is a way different route to take. But then that's precisely why that one's taking me a lot longer, because of doing a lot of research, among other things. And it basically it focuses on the impact of the culture within education. So the working title is The Education System We Have and the Education System We Need, with I would say the thesis statement being that you can predict with a high degree of accuracy the potential achievement of learners, as well as the potential growth and impact of educators based on the culture of the environment, far more than any sort of technology or pedagogical approach or anything along those lines. The original working title was Culture Eats Pedagogy for Breakfast, but that's now one of the chapters.
You could give us an elevator pitch on why Tequity is incredibly important in this era right now. Let's go.
So I'll share with you, and I think it's important, and it's something I encourage educators to do, is whenever you hear a person use a term of art, if you can, which I think some people do this intentionally, but nevertheless, if you can, always ask them to define it, because having a definition in context can help lead us to a better understanding. So I define Tequity as merging the effective use of educational technology with culturally responsive and culturally relevant learning experiences to support student development of essential skills and higher order thinking. So that's how I define it.
Yeah, it's very.
And the whole idea around that is to distill it into 2 distinct parts. There is the infrastructure access, meaning, Do I have access to the devices? Do I have access to the internet? What kind of device am I using? And what is the quality of that internet access? And this is where I always question and encourage districts to not hedge their bets on one singular platform. So in other words, don't be just a fill in the blank district or only buy, for example, Chromebooks. And I have nothing against Chromebooks. In fact, I think Chromebooks are a good entry point because at a minimum, I always say whatever money you're going to spend, always spend it on what's going to give you the best opportunity to put a device in the hands of every single child to start. Okay. But so there's the accessibility and infrastructure part. Then the second part to the TEQuity is how is it being used? Are we simply digitizing lessons? Is the types of assessment or the ways in which tech is being used that someone would say is tech savvy, nothing more than a digitization of lessons to support rote memorization and regurgitation of information. Okay, so when you get into that dynamic, that's the whole idea around not just TEQuity, but digital equity in general is, again, do I have the access? And if I do, what am I doing with that access? And we really, really have to really start pushing. I had hoped that the lesson would be learned more definitively during the pandemic, but I also recognize that we have to give educators a high degree of grace because in many cases, you have classroom educators, site administrators, and district leaders that were literally having to make decisions within minutes, days. They didn't have the luxury of building a year's worth of data or things like that. So I fully understand the need to have to pivot like we did, but we're also in that window of refreshing of all that tech that was acquired back then. And I'm starting to look at the narratives that are being propagated around a regression, or the term I like to use is retrenchment, meaning let's go back to the basics. Let's go back to what we did before that, because clearly it didn't work. And I'm like, well, what are you using to gauge whether it worked or not? What are the things that you had direct control over? What PD was provided? What were your expectations on that? Right. And why is going back? Why should that not be an option? Like that assumes that going back to what existed prior was actually working. And newsflash, it wasn't working for all students.
It was not working.
No, some of that is in the book. Yes. So I have the book TEQuity and then some of the other stuff around, again, the culture of our environments, understanding and recognizing how bad gaslighting is in education. I have a whole chapter called the four C's of toxicity or toxic culture in education, which are coercion, compliance, conformity, and codependency, and how that plays a role in the overall approach and the well-being of not just the learners, but also the educators. The whole idea around recognizing that it is unrealistic to expect students to be whole if you're not ensuring that the adults are whole. Right. Most SEL programs are not culturally responsive, and they're also not definitively responsive to and supporting the needs of the adults.
Yeah, so Ken, if you don't want to talk about this, we don't have to, but I remember having a conversation with you at NiceGate about your time as an educator when you were hired as the only Black educator in your district.
Correct. My whole career.
Yeah, so can you tell me a bit about what advice would you give to an administrator if they were trying to add more diversity to their staff?
Some of the districts I've had the privilege of working with, especially within the HR departments, is the whole idea around a couple of things. So unlike what many of the prevailing narratives are against diversity, diversity can be a strength when it is implemented in definitive and non-performative ways. And what I mean by that is the following. So first of all, when it comes to diversity amongst your hiring pool, the more you expand that pool, the more likely you are to get the best qualified candidate. So let's start off there. Second to that is the importance around gaining new perspectives, new ideas, and new thoughts around many of the things that exist in our case within our educational systems and institutions. And so for schools that are looking at diversifying their educator workforce, I always encourage them to do two things. One, be intentional about soliciting applications from a diverse pool. Second, when it comes to hiring, don't look to tokenize via a checkbox by saying, well, we got one check and then that's it, because then that's not, one, that's no good. Two, that also runs a risk of being disingenuous. And so the whole idea being, and there's data that shows it, especially obviously in my context around being a Black male educator, as there was a report by the United States Department of Education released back in 2016, there literally was a report on the lack of diversity educator workforce, and that report has an entire section devoted to the impact of students across all racial, ethnic, gender identity, and socioeconomic, across all those spectrums, as the impact of having even just one Black male educator has on those students. And of course, for me, my whole thing with that report is I can just speak to my own experiences with that, on how it serves as a representational catalyst for students that look like me of what's possible, what it means to go to college, what it means to be educated, what it means to be, and for the privileges of many of my experiences, being a world traveler, being a former athlete, having all these things that take what might look as one individual, but you've got all these perspectives. Then the dialogue I had with many of the students that didn't look like me dismantles many of the stereotypes that they may have a perception of, especially given whatever messaging they received in the media. It also promotes egalitarianism, which is this whole idea around, wow, so I've seen excellence in a person who doesn't look like me. It also means that I can see excellence in myself, or the potential for that, among many other things. And like I said, I know it's in the report, but I'm not going to, but I could literally write an entire book on my experiences in that capacity as
But
well.
I remember you mentioning that you didn't feel like they maybe gave you enough support.
No. When I was in the classroom, it was right around 2% of public school educators.
Wow.
I think it's 1.4% now. And so there were all the instances of dealing with bias, implications of race, implications of all of those things, especially being the only one. So I already stood out based on my racialized identity. Then I'm going to stand out based on the approach that I'm taking. And then I'm going to stand out based on the impact that it's having on the kids.
I think that's really important, what you were just saying, for like administrators to think about all of that as they're trying to break these biases that we're going to be talking about the rest of the episode, to be able to make sure they support the teachers that they hire. Because if they don't support them, then they're just going to quit, and that's going to be counterintuitive to the whole conversation we're about to have.
Right. Well, quit or not even enter the educator workforce.
It's true. Okay, so we're going to hop into AI bias and discrimination. So for those of you that want, in the resources, I have a whole slideshow for you. There's a video for you to watch that really gives you a nice visual about all the biases in AI. We're going to talk about them here, but there's a short YouTube video. And then I'm going to show you some biases that I found in image generation. But before I do that, I just want to ask Ken to define AI bias and discrimination.
Yeah, so it's the propensity for unreliable, undesirable, or inequitable results to appear in the data and or the results due to problematic data and or design. I have a more formalized definition. If you give me 1 second, I could even share it with you, but that's essentially what it is. Give me 1 second.
Ken will look that up, and I'll talk through some images that I have. So I was very fortunate to very recently listen to Ken speak at a Lyric TLI virtual keynote, and he was telling us this goes back to biases in like Google images back before AI images. So if you Google professional hairstyle or you Google image search unprofessional hairstyle, I've put it there for you in the slides. Out of the, I don't know how many images I'm looking at, there's a couple white females and the rest are all Black females. So that was very eye-opening for me to see that. And Ken did it live on the keynote. You could just Google it yourself too. You don't need to look at my research.
Yeah. In fact, I do think there's a couple of important things with this. One, definitely Google yourself, because I've actually had some people respond saying, are you using an incognito window because it has your search history? And I'm like, feel free to do the search yourself. Yeah. It's there. Yeah. Doing the comparison of professional hairstyle and unprofessional hairstyle is a very easy one. Some of the other ones are a bit more harder to catch. My formalized definition of bias, which is the potential for automated systems like machine learning models, searches, or algorithms to produce skewed, prejudiced, and or unfair results due to problematic data and or design. That's how I define bias in this context.
That is a deep statement. It's like a lot to process. The image I showed you with the professional and unprofessional, that was just algorithms in existing biases of images. But now we're going to go into AI bias and discrimination. These are examples from my actual school district. So on the left, I just think that one's interesting. I wrote a diverse group of students. And if you look at the picture, there's one girl of color and
That's
the
it.
rest are completely all white and the teacher's white and everyone's white. So I was like, that is not a diverse group of students. That's interesting. And then on the right, you'll notice a bulletin board we had. So that was in our foreign language department, and our students were learning about describing a face. They wrote in French description of either themselves or a character, and we popped it into an AI image generator. And I am not joking you, 100% of them were white. And then we had to tell them to go back and specify skin tone
Right. Because that's the default. Correct.
our population is only 40% white. So that doesn't even reflect themselves. So we had to go back and specify skin color. They didn't initially do because they think past and through skin color, and
Correct.
the AI doesn't because they default to white. So I just wanted to show some examples of that. And then one of my teachers today was doing a Minecraft door challenge for Valentine's Day, and they were generating an image of another teacher who is from the Barbados, and they were describing her skin color, and it kept coming up white, even though they were specifying and trying different words to get the skin color correctly. So I'm going to pop that one in there for you guys as well with the prompt so you can see it later. So Ken, is there anything else you want to add to this AI bias?
Well, I mean, hopefully we will be able to get to it at some point, because the thing for me is the following. This exists within a data set. So even if you go back to your Google images, there's two elements to reason why that's in the results. Number one, that's how those images are indexed. So when you search, the terms that are part of the metadata of the image are the search terms. So the fact that it says unprofessional and hairstyle, that's how those images have been tagged, indexed. Right. Then the algorithm is going to go based upon that to determine the prioritization of the results. So yes, you could scroll and you'll see a pattern. You'll eventually see a few, for example, non-Black representations there. But nevertheless, that's based on, again, problematic data and problematic design. Now, when it comes to what you have on this slide around using AI image generators, this is exactly why I encourage folks to start asking the questions around what are the data sets that they're using. More often than not, the data sets they're using are literally from Google Images. And because they're not going to go through and remove those elements of the metadata, those things are going to be just by default and by design, they're going to be not just part of the data sets, but they will be influential in the types of results that you get. So my thing is, if you know that, then what are the things we can do to decrease the likelihood of it happening and mitigate the effects of it happening? And you just brought up an example of the approach, but even that approach is not going to be perfect, but we need to know that approach.
I love where this is going. That's where my head was at. I think before we go into what we could do about it, that's like our call to action for everyone. Let's talk about all the different types of biases that are in AI. So one that you touched on was the implicit bias in the existing data. So do you want to go, maybe let's start a bit more with that one because we're on it right now. So how is that data bias?
Well, so let's go back to the whole idea around what data are they using. So most of in fact, there's really only three, all others are derivatives, which hopefully we'll get into that later. But the big three large language models and image generators, they're pulling their data from the internet. Okay, so originally the top three sources of information were Reddit, social media, and YouTube. And then for the image generators, it was Google Images. So when you think in terms of that, and you think in terms of the internet, yes, it's like casting a big fishing net. You're going to catch some of the fish that you really want, but you're also going to catch some stuff that you don't want and that's not going to be helpful and might actually even be harmful. But when you're using such a massive net, you either got to pay some people a lot of money to spend a lot of time scrubbing that data, or you just say it's there and it is what it is and good luck. And so the whole idea around that connects to, even like the images that you shared and that you have here is, let's start off with the companies themselves. And this is precisely why a couple of questions I always ask, and I want to share with you all that, are the following. What is the diversity of your design and decision-making team? Are their perspectives and experiences aligned with those of the students? And what is their lived experience? And so if you think about it in that context, this is why I always tell educators, if you're going to use any AI platform, especially some of those that are being more pitched, promoted, and propagated in education, your first clue as to whether or not that platform is going to be a reliable source for you and your students is to go to their page and go look at their board. Go look at their officers and their advisory board. Does it visually show, at minimum, a difference of perspective based on optics, representation, and likely experience? In their bios, if you glance at their bios, are they coming from lots and lots of different backgrounds? If they're using educators, which there are a couple of platforms that shall remain unnamed at the moment, that have hired educators. But when you look at their officers and their advisory board and who they've hired, it's not a coincidence that the educators that they hired look exactly like their advisory board and most of their officers.
Yeah.
So again, it's the whole idea around how can I expect a platform to be responsive, relevant, and useful for a student population of which you don't have anyone that is within the context of the decision-making realm that at minimum shares some elements of that experience. And that's where you can get into some of the ethical components too. But then the other thing with a lot of these platforms is, first of all, they're not going to build their data sets from scratch. And I know we'll get into that later because I'll get into the whole idea around problematic design. But for now, based on your question,
go into it. Go into it.
Okay, well, so now the first question is to look at who are the decision makers and what is their lived experience. Then the next question to follow up with that I always share with folks is the following questions to ask. What data sets are you using? Is that data labeled and is it supervised? And so what a lot of people don't know is that nobody's going to build a platform from scratch. They're going to source their data. Nowadays, they're likely to source their data from OpenAI's API. So to explain it so that the listeners will hear this is that OpenAI essentially created this platform, and their original data acquisition was, like I shared, it was from the internet. So it was social media, Reddit, YouTube, Wikipedia, things that already exist out there. Where's all the stuff that exists?
And the New York Times, because there's a whole lawsuit right now with that too. But
correct. I mean, there's going to be more and more lawsuits to come down the pipeline. But so that's where they start. Then how do they add on to that data? As people do things like starting to pull data from blog posts and then starting to pull data from what I would say some areas that are highly, highly questionable, like 4chan. Now, the reason why that matters is there's so much data that they have to have. In fact, if I remember correctly, the current version of ChatGPT is over 4 billion parameters. That's 4 billion data sets. They're not going to label it and they're not going to supervise it. No. And so then it goes into the whole idea around, okay, if that's the case, then how is a platform designed? Who wrote the algorithms that are prioritizing the information? Based on what lived experience, as well as what biases do they have that they're determining, as you just showed, what information is most relevant based on this query or this prompt? And the reason why that's also dangerous is that in the technical side of this there's an assumption that more of something must mean it's right. If you do a simple Google search, the way the links appear, it's based on what's called backtracking. That means that the top link, for example, let's say you're doing research and you type in, for you, it would be like architectural history of New York City, for example.
Okay.
What's the probability that Wikipedia is going to be in the first two links? Probably the first link.
Yeah.
That's because most people have clicked on Wikipedia as a starting point. So therefore, what it does is it says, oh, a lot of people are clicking on this link based on this query. That must mean it's useful information. So therefore, it's going to appear higher in the results.
Soon they're going to have sponsors, and I bet people are going to pay to have their content.
So what you're bringing up is where you get into the information literacy part. Is when you do a search, be mindful of what you click on first. Let's say if I'm really savvy with my search engine optimization and I start a coffee cafe, okay, and I know that people are likely within my certain geographical distance of my area are going to want to search for a cafe. So one, I'm going to make sure that all sorts of different terms are within the metadata of my website so that even if you misspell cafe with 2 F's, it's still going to pull my website up. Now, here's where the information literacy really kicks in, is you'll have a sponsored link and then you'll have the actual link. If I click on that sponsored link, Google gets some money because they use it that's what Google is a marketing company. So they get some money for that. But if I click on the actual link and bypass the sponsored link, they don't. That's the whole idea around how they design the user interface for that. But connecting that to the artificial intelligence component is that those same types of prioritization of information, algorithmic design, bias embedded in who's doing the coding, what they're prioritizing coding, all of that is essentially not only replicated, but it is now automated within artificial intelligence.
Yeah. We'll also want to tell the listeners about the black box problems if they don't know about that. A lot of the models, we don't understand how they're making decisions. So we know there's biased data in there, and we know it's probably giving us biased information back, but we can't ask it to explain where it's getting the information from. So it's really challenging for us to understand who, what, when, where, how. So do you maybe want to talk a bit about that?
Oh yeah, as you know, I keep pulling it up as a reference because I want to make sure I bring these things up accurately. So I always talk about the need and the understanding of digital literacy and digital fluency when it comes to artificial intelligence. So I'll share with everyone, I define digital literacy in this context as the ability to use information technology and digital media to find, evaluate, create, and share information effectively, responsibly, and safely. So that's the literacy part. The fluency part is the ability to choose and use technology comfortably, effectively, and intuitively. So if I understand how to use artificial intelligence intuitively, then I also need to find, evaluate, and use that information effectively and responsibly. And the reason why I mention that, and you bring up the black box thing, is I always tell people, you want to know how you can break a large language model? Constantly ask it to justify the results. If you're asking it to give you a list, here's an example of where I say using what I say is transformative language. Don't ask it to give you a list. Ask it to give you an unabridged or complete list and include a justification for what's on that list and where did you get that list from?
Oh, wait, you said this in your lyric thing. Do you want the best information or do you want all
the question I would ask, do you want the best information or do you want all of the information? Correct. Again, that goes into a lot of the work I do around information literacy and media literacy, but it really applies here as well. And it's a question I encourage educators to ask the minute that you're in a session that a presenter is talking about artificial intelligence. First question you ask yourself, are they giving me all of the information or are they only giving me the best information? Because if they're only giving you the best information, then they're really only telling you a part of the story. And I just think it doesn't help us as education by oversimplifying and skewing into, I'm going to tell you what's best. You know, like you can't simultaneously value critical and analytical thinking, but then say you're only going to give people the best information. It doesn't work that way. That's cognitive dissonance right there. Yeah. But my main point around that is, again, going back to your black box reference, I just did this last week with a group. I talked to them about the power of synonyms when it comes to using large language models. So I said, have it give you a list of 10 synonyms for mindfulness. They did that. Said, perfect. Now here's where we're going to really force it to do what it supposedly promises to do, the reasoning part. So now instead of give me a list of 10 synonyms for mindfulness, it's give me an unabridged list of 10 synonyms for mindfulness. Include a description of each, a rationale for why you chose each one, and where you got that information from. And you see the results were vastly different. And of course, that's when, again, now you're starting to get towards all of the information. And I go, every time if you ask a large language model to provide a rationale or a justification for what you put in the results, you are forcing it to utilize within its promise of its reasoning capabilities. But you also will see where it is not capable of always doing that. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about cultural context, but that's the whole point, is that when it is incapable of doing that, then for you as an educator and for our learners, now you know areas where one is very weak, and you can potentially fill in a gap with going back to the literacy, information that is effective, responsible, and useful.
So while we're just talking about the information literacy, how do you recommend that a teacher or student know if the information that they're receiving is biased? Like what can they do about it? If they're using a text-based AI generator or an image, some of them you said are a little bit more challenging to tell. So how would they know?
I mean, the whole idea is to go through a thinking routine. So number one, always vet the results. If it gives you links, go to the links. If it gives you citations, go confirm those citations. One of the things that I love to encourage educators to do is use the exact same prompt in 3 different large language models. So if you're using, for example, ChatGPT, copy and paste that same prompt into Claude, copy and paste that same prompt into what is now Gemini. Look at how the results are going to be different, because even if they're using the same data sets, the algorithms are coded differently, which means it's prioritizing information differently. That's how you can do it. Now, if you're getting the exact same thing across multiple and different platforms, that increases the likelihood that that information is going to be reliable, but you always have to follow it up. You cannot take what it gives you at face value and then roll with that. You've always got to authenticate it from other sources. It goes back to the whole idea around doing research. Like if I go to one source and I say, here's my one source, then how do I know that that source is reliable? Which is a whole nother conversation for us to have on research and
Yeah, for sure.
especially in education.
I know. We've been talking a lot about chatbots, but I feel like we forget sometimes that AI is built into a lot of the educational tools and websites
Correct.
that we're using all the time. So there's bias in all of those as well. So all
Correct.
of this just reinforces the stereotypes and reinforces all of the bias that's already there. So I'll say a few bullets and then I'll let you dive into them. But the impact on educational access, so access to culturally relevant content, bias in course placement, and bias in assessments and grading. So why don't you run with that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So one is to discern the difference between generative AI and predictive AI. The whole idea around generative AI is that the data sets are the starting point, but what happens is that the machine learning, if you will, it starts to learn based on predictive patterns. So in other words, as it gets used more and more and more, it starts to identify alternate patterns within those data sets. That's how it learns. That's how the data sets grow. That's the whole idea around, the term of art is used as training the bot. So that's the generative side. That's how it's generative. It generates new information, although it's not really new. It just generates new patterns. There is no artificial intelligence cannot generate something brand new. It's just what I always say is just taking a pattern and looking at how that pattern is oftentimes remixed or derivatives of that pattern. Predictive AI is a little bit different. Predictive AI uses data sets and patterns to predict something that's going to happen. So it's not so much based upon what has already happened that it now is generative. It's based on what's already happened, what's likely to be next. The example I always use is I do a string of numbers and I say, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what's next? 7. Well, we already know this. So you predicted 7. That's based on past patterns, right? That's exactly how predictive AI works. Where we have to be very careful, and this goes to the ethical questions and some of those other questions I encourage educators to ask, is when predictive AI becomes embedded into many of our educational systems and institutions. And I know for a fact it's being used in a lot of school districts to do things like predict which students are likely to be troublemakers, which students are likely to be highly gifted, which students are likely to be diverse learners and have needs that are in accordance with a 504 plan or an IEP. Okay. And then now, if you consider historical context, what could go wrong?
Yeah, nothing. No, I'm just kidding.
And then even get into patterns of, like you mentioned, patterns of assessment and grading. Like, okay, I mean, based on what, and that this goes back to those questions. What data sets are you using? Is it labeled and is it supervised? Who's on your decision-making team? What are their life experiences? And again, I did this social experiment at a conference, and it's interesting to watch how some of the vendors are either apprehensive or what I would say they are intentionally avoiding answering those questions. And it tells me one of two things. Either one, you want to basically bask in the comforts of willful ignorance to accept no responsibility for the consequences or potential dangers. And then two, I know that you're using most likely the OpenAI data sets, which means that the bias and all the other things that we should be aware of is already in them, but you just don't want to admit it.
I'm going to ask you your question.
Yes.
How can AI dismantle historic inequalities and predictable barriers to student successes? That's your own question.
Yeah, so my whole thing around that is one, to start to look at it as another invaluable digital resource, not dissimilar to things like Wikipedia back in the day, or even when Google search. became ubiquitous back in the day. And so if you think about some of our historical inequities, so I'll just pick one. Historical inequity that exists in schools of no fault and consequence of teachers, by the way, is an inefficiency of the feedback loop. So there is plenty of peer-reviewed research from multiple sources that feedback is one of the most definitive mechanisms for learning and growth. Like, think about it. We all need feedback. If I don't get feedback, then I have no idea if I'm right, if I'm wrong, what I'm doing. Okay, so that's one. So if AI were to be used in the literacy and fluency capacity that I shared earlier in the way I defined it, that's one historical inequity that could exist around the feedback loop. And when used effectively, that feedback can be customized to be responsive to you, the individual, unlike your classmate sitting next to you. So, for example, let's say that your writing tends to be predictive in your use of pronouns and your use of third person. I can now say, okay, we're going to use the AI and we're going to say, this is what I'm writing. These are the goals of my writing. These are the areas that I tend to be repetitive, and these are the areas that I tend to be weak. Based on this information, provide feedback in accordance with that on the following.
And that's if it's not biased in the way the algorithms work, right?
Well, so correct. But I guess my main thing with that is that, what's important is that the bias is there. And so if we know it ahead of time, see, we can use, I have a slide that I use now called human plus AI, AI plus human. And I said, we want much more of the former and a whole lot less of the latter. Unfortunately, the way it's being pitched right now is too much of the latter. Think about it. Oh, here's ways to save time. Here's ways to do this. Here's ways to do that. All of that is ways to decrease the human side and increase the AI side. My approach is the opposite. My approach is, if I know the data sets run the risk of bias and I know it's in the algorithms, then what are the things that I can do to decrease the likelihood?
What are they?
Again, and that's why I always say, to oversimplify it, more context equals better output.
I have a slide about the super prompt, so that's in there. I know that that's in your super prompt.
Perfect. Yeah, we can get to that, because that super prompt gets into the whole idea around the fear mongering of, well, students are going to cheat, it's plagiarism, they're just going to have it write their essays for them. We definitely want to save time for that. But the whole idea around it is to think about, a lot of the historical inequities and barriers. So I would even say, do something else, and I actually did this with a school here in the Los Angeles area. As I said, what would it look like to use AI to redesign many of your summative assessments and have them be within culturally relevant context? And I go, so that AI lacked cultural context, but we can force it into the AI by giving it the cultural context as a part of the prompt. So it were things like, I'm working with a historically excluded and marginalized student population that live in an economically under-resourced area. Historically, the students have, based on standardized exam, have performed 1 or 2 levels below grade level in their reading and their math. Based upon this information, I want to assign an assessment that accounts for that also encourages students to connect what they're learning, which in this case was a science class, to living in an urban environment that is economically under-resourced, that lacks greenery, and that lacks the public resources that you often look for, like parks and things like that. Like, we gave it so much context, it was almost like we wrote a full essay.
Yeah,
that's the prompt. The whole idea was, you force it. You say, these are the way I described it to the group was this. What we're putting in this prompt, we are giving it the guideposts and the guardrails. Yes. It's not going to have them. So we're telling you, this is the realm we want you to operate within before we give you the prompt to give us something to start from.
Right. And that's why I feel like it's incredibly important for a teacher that just thinks students shouldn't use AI, because it's not if they use it. It's not like a yes or no. It's how they use it. So if they use it, if they use it in the way you're describing, then I think the teacher would look at it a lot differently, because the way that they prompted it and the information that they put into that initial prompt shows that they have the knowledge that they really need to understand and comprehend what they're asking for. So I think that was a really beautiful example of the how you use AI, not it.
And remember, that goes back to the whole equity thing. It's not if we have access, it's do we have access, and then how are we using the tech?
Exactly. Yeah.
The same thing applies here. Exactly.
Exactly. It's very similar. Okay, so now how does AI bias and discrimination impact student success?
Okay, so the whole idea around impact on student success is twofold. One, again, it's elements around how timely and efficient is my feedback? Is it personalized feedback? Is it relevant to that individual learner? And is it within the context of not only where they currently are, but where I want them to be and the environments that they operate within? So that's number one. The other thing is what I would say is a redesign of many of our forms of assessment. How are we ensuring that the assessment, again, if I were in the classroom now, I would use AI heavily for assessing students in the context of, let's say, prior to a project. Here's where you are. Now I need to know where you want to be. And I will use it to help me differentiate the assessment in accordance with the growth that I like to see operationalized by you, the individual. So that's one part. I always say, think about what barriers exist that are financial. So, for example, how often are students in economic under-resourced areas provided access to tutors? It won't replace a tutor, but it
Right.
certainly can provide another resource that you often go to a tutor for.
For sure. It bothers me so much when school districts block it because I'm like, the students that have access, let's say they have a phone or another computer, they have access. The students that don't have access are now at an extreme disadvantage. Something like,
Correct.
let's just take the traditional college essay. The kids that have always had a tutor. Now the students that could never afford a tutor sort of have a tutor to help guide them with this college essay, but we're stripping that right away from them and we're
Correct.
widening this gap that's already existing. And that's going to lead right into the next segment, real world consequences. Some other examples I came up with were if a company's hiring and they're using AI data and they're like, we can use our data to find the most successful candidate. And I used quotes for those of you listening, successful candidate based on what we've hired before. Well, the humans that were making those hiring decisions maybe made some biased decisions. So all the data that's going into someone's applying for a loan, if someone's applying for a job, the data that they're using is biased. So it's going to really widen and increase these existing biases that are in the world. And it's going to have a really negative impact on a lot of people. What do you think about that?
Just look at tech companies. Go back to the question I posed earlier around who are the decision makers.
Yeah.
So if you go based on historical patterns, and then now they want to use AI, again, predictive. They want to use AI to determine who the best candidate is. I will say it on here. The best candidate is likely to be an upper middle class cis hetero white male. That's who has been hired with a disproportionately high degree of frequency.
What other real world impact do you think it's going to have that people aren't thinking about or talking about?
I think for me, when it comes to, I don't necessarily co-sign with all the fear mongering in education around, well, if you don't use it, AI, someone's going to take your job. I reject that on a myriad of levels. But the real world consequences are not developing an awareness of how to leverage emerging technologies for a useful purpose. So, for example, even in that context, in fact, I just did a workshop for a CTE division of a school district, and I said, I would do all of the following. I would insert into all of your CTE programs right now. Number one, I would have the students not only write a resume, but I would also have AI give them feedback on their resume, dependent upon where they're looking to be gainfully employed. I would also have them do things like analysis on the company or the business that you are looking to get a job with. What do they do? Where are your strengths? Where are your strengths in alignment with what they do? And maybe some weaknesses that they have. And I go, and then the last thing I would do is I liken it to my experiences with football. Even though I played one position on the offense, I still studied a playbook to where I knew where everybody else was doing. And the reason why I say that is what I shared with them was I would actually have the students go through the process of developing a business plan using AI as well to run their own business. I go, they may have no desire, no entrepreneurial goals, but if you understand all of that, now when it comes time for an interview, it will help you with what types of questions to ask. And two, you'll have a more comprehensive understanding of how a business is run. Those are real world consequences, not necessarily in a negative way. Some of the negative things, again, are not being able to discern the value of the information, not developing the literacy and the fluency components that are necessary, that I think are transformative. And I'll use another real world consequence example, and this goes into the whole idea around media literacy. If you don't develop those skill sets, then you're a lot more likely to be easily manipulated based on disinformation that is spread. And keep in mind, even something as simple as we're coming up on a presidential election cycle. What's the likelihood that deep fakes are going to be all over the place? That headlines are going to be misleading and misinformation or disinformation? You see that?
It's 100% likely. What do you mean? It's 100% going to happen.
Correct. And so that's an example of another real world consequence. So my whole thing is, so tell me again why we should be blocking and not using these things.
You want me to tell you why we should be
No,
blocking?
I'm saying I pose that because I know you and I are of like mind on this. It's no, there's more than just, I guess my whole thing is it's more than just, no, we can't use it.
Yeah,
there's a domino effect there.
Like what you're saying about literacy, it's all about media literacy. And I guess we just have to trust certain content providers that they're giving us accurate information. And like we talked a little bit before about like Wikipedia, it's a good place to start, right? But you got to back it up with something legitimate.
Correct.
And
I don't trust them. I operate from a degree of inherent distrust. I take information, but I'm going to confirm it and authenticate it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But
my default is not to trust at the start.
But like, let's say like a news source now, I think we need to really make sure that news sources have information to back it up, or like some way for us to trust a source.
Correct. In my conversation with that cybersecurity expert, he said that it is generally the accepted number within his niche component of the tech industry is that 75% of all content produced right now has either been generated by AI or touched by AI. 75%.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, and it's going to go up.
Yeah,
so to me, it's why we should be asking, the follow-up questions. We should be asking those questions I shared around the data sets, the labeling, the supervision. We should be questioning within education. We should be questioning all of these platforms that are adding AI. We should be questioning, okay, what are you adding? How are you ensuring that it is in accordance with the mission and the purpose of the company? How are you ensuring that it's useful for students? And what information and what data do you have to back your assessment of that?
The next two follow-up questions about that, leading right into it. What is the responsibility of like a school or university or the teacher? So what are our responsibilities to make sure, and how can we hold companies accountable?
So I'm going to share the questions I bring up, and I will share with you all, and especially for your audience, the ways in which we hold them accountable is with our dollars. These companies can't exist without schools and school districts spending money. And so to me, the whole thing is, how do we take that paradigm of I'm selling you something that you need to, I'm going to spend money on something I need, and you need to be in accordance with what my expectations are of it. And so that's the reason why, again, I go back to the questions that I always say, questions to always ask when it comes to artificial intelligence, whether it be a new platform add-on, platform redesign, or a startup looking to impact education. What data sets are you using? Is that data labeled? Is that data supervised? What is the diversity of your design and decision-making team? Are their perspective and experiences aligned with those of the students? What is their lived experience in proximity to those likely most to be impacted? Okay, and then the last question, what is the intended impact you want to have on education? How will it counter the status quo? And more specifically, how will it dismantle historical and or institutional barriers to learning?
So it's okay if you don't want to publicly go on the record and recommend one, but if you were going to tell people a safer one to use, which one do you think is the least biased? Not saying it might still be biased, but like least.
Well, I mean, I guess my thing is it really all three are different. So one is the design of the system itself. The second one is who made a decision of the design of the system. And then the third one is the results of that.
But which one do you feel the most comfortable? Which one do you feel the most comfortable using? Or you don't want to say it. It's okay.
I mean, for me, I ask all of them. Again, there's a reason why, because they're in three distinct buckets.
You're saying, okay, you use all of them.
Yes.
Every time you do anything.
Every time I talk to a company or I speak with folks that are looking at either acquiring a platform, or they already have an existing platform and there's going to be an AI add-on that either is going to be embedded into what you already pay for, or they want you to pay a little extra for it. It's to ask those questions, because ultimately the whole idea is, if your platform is designed to have an impact on education, I think it's totally a legitimate question for us to ask. What exactly is the impact that you want it to have? And based on what information can you provide that is going to do that? And who made that determination?
And you're saying, as like a teacher or educator, if you're going to run something through AI, to run it through multiple AIs, not just
I would, yes, because they're not all the same. Even if they all say, well, we use similar data sets, it's fine. But remember, they're programmed and coded differently.
Okay, I'm probably ruining it, but in my next episode, I'm going to share with you how I rolled out AI to my students in my district with a focus on AI bias and discrimination. However, there was one question that came up, and I'm going to address it here on this episode with Ken. A Black fourth grader said to me, AI would think I was a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And my stomach dropped. And your words were, well, he's not wrong. What advice would you give to a teacher that was in my shoes on how to handle that moment?
I mean, that goes back to, again, this is why it shouldn't be blocked. And that result is not a surprise when you think in terms of, again, historical context. And so to me, I would say, okay, if it would think that, now what, one, does that mean we should stop using it? And then two, if the answer is no, we shouldn't stop using it, what is the approach we can do to force it to not think that?
What is the approach? What can that boy do in that moment if he's in fourth grade?
I mean, I would acknowledge that. That's what I'm saying. I would acknowledge that, yes, it may think that, but it doesn't have to be the only thing that it thinks. Again, we can train it. We can tell it what we want. If it's going to think that, what are the things that we can do to basically tell it, you need to stop thinking this because this is not me.
Right.
You don't want it to speak for you. You want to tell it what you need. And you may have to tell it, I'm not a criminal. I mean, again, reasoning, I would do that. Oh, you think I'm a criminal, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me, what information are you using to determine that?
It probably can't even give you legitimate information. It probably can't.
But you see what I'm saying? Can either sweep those things under the rug and hope that it's not going to show up, or we can acknowledge that those things exist. And it doesn't, in that context with that student, if it were me in the classroom, I would have said all those things that you shared. And I would have said, listen, let me tell you a quick story about my experience on how other people try to define me. And I refuse to let anyone define who I am and what I can be.
Yeah.
So there's another lesson to that beyond just that. But again, this is precisely why it's important for us to acknowledge that these types of things exist. And by the way, I would have shared with that student on a personal level, a lot of that messaging that's in that AI that's doing this, that was in a lot of the books I was forced to read when I was in school. So It ain't just in the tech. By the way, those books is probably likely in the data sets in the tech.
It definitely is. It definitely.
This is the whole idea of that. So again, my whole thing, now that we know it's there, or now that we can predict that it's there, what are the things that we can do to reduce the likelihood of it appearing? It goes back to the example I like to share about, driving on a road. If you know that a dead end exists ahead of time, then now we can say, I know if I turn right, that's a dead end road. So now that I know that, I'm not going to turn right. If I know that's here, I'm not going to allow it to do that. I'm going to tell it what I need within specific guidelines and parameters, knowing that it still may show up, but I'm going to at least decrease the likelihood of that happening.
Yeah, I love that. The way I rolled this out to my students was, now they're hypercritical of AI generated content. And I think a lot of ways that people are rolling this out to students, they're rolling it out in a positive way, which I do think it is a very positive tool. The way I rolled it out, now my students know that they have to be detectives. And it's a great tool, but they need to be a detective, and they need to really analyze the AI generated content to know, is it biased? Is there misinformation? And then they need to put it in their own words and fact check it. So I feel like the way I rolled it out was very critical lens, and not like, oh, let's use it because it's cool and fun.
Correct. So, remember, that goes back to how I define digital literacy and digital fluency. So yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we're not going to probably have to get to the super prompt today, because
we
could save that for a whole other episode.
No problem.
And then Ken also does a really great job with Beyond the Basics. So I think a lot of people that you're hearing out in the field, in the industry, are talking about like the basics. And I think Ken does a really incredible job of going beyond the basics. And I'm sure we could probably have him back on to do a whole part 2 about that. Do you want to just give us a list of things that you talk about that are beyond the basics?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it goes to what I say is how do we develop a system of acute language skills when it comes to using artificial intelligence? And I divide that up into 3 definitive areas. So area number 1 is the use of synonyms and understanding that in using gaming technology, that's your power up. So synonyms. So for example, using condense rather than summarize. Those are synonymous. Using speed rather than fast. So you see, you have to understand what synonyms are, how they work, and then, of course, how do you do that in that context? And one of the things that I always bring up is if you can't think of any synonyms, well, guess what? Use the AI for that too. Because the whole idea being, I need it to generate synonyms for me, but I know what they are and how I intend to use them. So that's number 1. Also, the second thing is understanding causative language. Is there something, like I mentioned the feedback earlier, what is the cause and what is my desired effect? So it's called chain of thinking, and it's how I create a process in the way that I do a prompt to get that effect. And then the last one, as I just mentioned, is this whole idea around using transformative language. So what often happens that I've seen people do is they'll do things like turn this passage into a song. And I go, by doing that, watch what happens. It's going to replace words that are in that passage. And I go, that's why you understand transformative language. It's not turn it into, transform this passage into a song. And I would go, I would even further, transform this passage into a song and do not replace any of the words. You see what I'm saying? So it's an understanding of language and how we can utilize acute language skills in the context of everything from the large language models and the image generators. I do a thing where I think you saw it, where I talk about the 5 core components of visual storytelling. And if you understand those 5 components, which is actually not that difficult, by the way, that is now the basis of which you will generate your prompts for an image generator, providing context, providing setting, providing details, and some additional detail. You don't ask for a picture of a sunset. You ask for a picture of a sunset. Where is that sunset? What other things are in that image?
I saw that.
Yeah, exactly. That's my favorite example to use.
Yeah.
Is the sunset at the horizon, above the horizon, halfway down the horizon? Are there clouds? How many clouds are there? Are the clouds colored based on the sunset? Is there wind? What direction is the wind going? You see, all of those things. So my main point is that it's precisely why I talk about going beyond the basics, because it's the whole idea of going back to the original question. Do you want the best information or do you want all the information?
I mean, I want all of it. I hope we all want all of it.
All of us should want all of it, correct. If someone's just giving you a list of 10 prompts, they're giving you the best information, but of course they're determining what's best for you. And it's an oversimplification.
For sure. That's why when we talk about like process over product, like the learning process is more important than the end product. So like discovering that on your own, getting there on your own, I think is a more valuable skill to learn than just what you get at the end. So here's famous 3 questions that I ask every time. I usually ask them in the beginning, but we just dove right in. So can you just tell us one creative way you use AI personally and one creative way you use it professionally?
I guess personal and professional, there's kind of a gray area there. So personally, I've used it, for example, with sessions that I have where I feel like the title is stale, and I basically give it some ideas around, here's what I'm looking at transforming a title to. And then give me an unabridged list and a justification for how you change the title. I've also used it, for example, just to play around. I've used it in ways of like, I'll say, I have the following ingredients in my refrigerator at the moment. What are 3 different types of dishes I can prepare using these ingredients in an oven, on the stove, or on the grill?
And you're a foodie too, so.
Correct. And then professionally, I've used it for things like, honestly, Dee and I are using it for our book. We did our book in the following. So he and I have a podcast that we're going to restart recording. Anyway, so we recorded our conversations because we're like, we've been talking about this too much. We need to record it. So we recorded. Then he did voice to text conversion. Then we went through it, organized our writing as far as cleaning up, the voice to text. And then we're like, okay, well, based upon this, we kind of already have our chapters, but let's run it through AI and let's see what it tells us.
That's what I did. I did the same dictation thing as you.
Exactly. And what was interesting was what it told us was it was okay, but it wasn't quite what we wanted.
Mhm.
And so then now professionally, we're using it as an ancillary editor. We have an editor, but we're also like, well, there's nothing wrong with gaining additional perspectives. And again, using different platforms to do that. But those are the main ways I do it. Sometimes if I have to design a workshop that, I tend to over plan. And so I'll do things like, this is my outline for this workshop. I generally design it for 4 hours, but in this workshop, I only have 2 hours. So what are the essential components that I should consider removing without taking away the spirit and the goals of the workshop itself? So those are the ways that I use it, both personally and professionally.
I think that that's so important. I always try to tell to keep my voice. It takes away my voice. And if you train it the right way, it can keep your same voice.
Correct.
Yeah. So now where do you draw the line? Like when would you never use AI?
Sending notes, responding to emails in a personal or professional capacity. I would never use it. I never, if I were to use it, it wouldn't be my finished product. So I think never comes with a caveat there or in air quotes. But I also know that like with AI, I would be less inclined to use it. Anything that involves historical context, especially given the fact that I'm a Black male. I know some folks use it to generate ideas around Black History Month. And I say, well, that's fine for the ideas, but you should also recognize that that information is highly likely not, at a minimum, it's going to be incomplete. And in some cases, it may actually even be inaccurate.
Right.
So I don't know that I would never use it, but I would certainly be mindful of what am I using it for? And what are the things I need to be mindful of it based on the results?
All right. Now, third question. How do you envision the future of education in a world with artificial intelligence?
Well, envision right now is an increase in the digital divide. Hopeful envision is that it will begin the process of dismantling some of the predictable barriers. And that's why I always tell people, if it's predictable, then it's also preventable. So there's two envisions. There's what may happen.
We don't want that one to happen. I don't think
but again, historical context, that is exactly what has happened. My concern, but then my hope for the promise is that it will provide a definitive and accessible resource to dismantle the predictability of experiences and outcomes for students, especially those that have been historically excluded and marginalized.
I usually sometimes ask people what keeps them up at night, but this whole episode pretty much is what keeps us up at night. So I don't even have to ask you that question.
Yeah, no problem.
I always like to ask the previous guest for a prompt for the next guest. So the previous guest was the E-twins, and their prompt for you was, Hola, Ken, if you were appointed as the U.S. Minister of Education, what would your initial 3 steps be?
So the E-twins, those are my hermanos. And if they listen to this, I'm going to share that I'm actually disappointed they didn't do the entire prompt en español. Hablo español más o menos. But actually, my Spanish is actually pretty good now. I've been practicing a lot more. So at any rate, so if I was appointed U.S. Minister of Education, well, we don't have a Minister of Education in the U.S., but in the spirit of this question, if I were appointed as the Secretary for the Department of Education, my initial 3 steps would be the following. One would be to, again, what are the historical barriers that have existed that continue to endure within the purview and the locus of control that I would have? What are the things that I can do around resource allocation to dismantle them? Then I would also look at what are the ways I can develop a sustainably effective marketing campaign that dismantles and dispels all of the prevailing narratives around education and educators that is leading to 2 things, which is demoralization and an exodus from the industry. And then 3, what are the policy level ways I can ensure equity throughout all of our educational systems and institutions, i.e., dismantle the predictability of access to funds based on existing funding models. And I guess the best way I can describe it is, rather than having it funnel down, how can we have it funnel out so that every single child entering the educational system is essentially afforded the growth and the opportunity to pursue anything that they want without barriers, without limitations, and with vigor and support. That's very generalized, but then again, that's the whole point.
It's it. You're going to be hired. We're making a new position in the U.S. called U.S. Minister of Education, and you're hired.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my thing, and part of answering that question is, if you were to think about what are some of the generational challenges that exist within our society that are still, that like we can look back 50 years, it was an issue then and it's an issue now. Well, there's a reason why it's not being solved. And so to me, it's, rather than addressing the symptoms, why don't we address the disease?
And why do you think that's not happening?
We'd have to record another podcast for that one. I have a lot of answers for that one.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know we went over, but it was just such a great conversation. It's always fun to be with you.
Yeah, likewise.
We're very thankful that you're here with us, Ken, and we're really looking forward to continuing our work with you in NICEScape.
To be continued.
Thank you, Ken. Always thought-provoking.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Generative Age, powered by NICEScape. For a deeper dive, check out my new book titled, How'd You Guess? The Generative Age, now available on Amazon.
Our journey may pause here, but the conversation doesn't need to end.
Stay connected and informed by following me on social media at Alana Winnick and subscribing to my newsletter, all conveniently accessible on my website, alanawinnick.com.
Don't just listen, be a part of it. With your free NICEScape membership, you can join these live discussions, enroll in our free Generative Age NICEScape community, where you can share resources, ask questions, and collaborate with like-minded colleagues. If you enjoyed this podcast, consider leaving a review and telling a colleague or a friend.
We've got so much more in store, so be sure to join us next time for another exciting conversation. Until then, keep learning and keep growing in the Generative Age.